This is a 4090, a very special 4090. You're probably thinking another gimmick, another feature that I don't need or is absolutely useless that I'm paying for. But I'd like to argue that this is the best 4090 you could get as a creator, especially if you're a 3D creator. We're going to be looking at the benchmarks and why I think this is definitely worth considering. So let's take a deeper look at the MSI Suprim Liquid X 4090 graphics card.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
Now, I've actually got this graphics card mounted in this PC, as you can see. It's the top graphics card there, and the AIO goes in there. Basically, this is a liquid-cooled GPU, but instead of running a custom loop on it, it's already got 240mm AIO included. So you can't take it apart, you don't have to assemble anything. The card comes there with a 240mm radiator and 220mm fans that you have to attach to the radiator. Now, you don't need any extra fan headers, by the way. The fans are connected to the cables that come from the GPU, so the GPU fan curves also apply to the fan curves on the actual radiator. There's a little PWM connector that comes out in the end of the tubes there. The card is very, very small, and as you can see, compared to some of the tough 4090s that I have in here, it's very skinny and actually short as well. It's got dual BIOS, gaming and silent mode. I'd always leave it at gaming because, believe it or not, it's very, very silent. And it's got the 16-pin new 12-volt connector that we have for the GPUs. Now we're going to be comparing this card to other two MSI cards. The lower end 4090 Gaming X Trio 4090. Then we have the 4090 Suprim X, which is the premium version of MSI graphics card. And then the ultra premium version of MSI cards, which is this 4090 Suprim X Liquid X, which is basically Suprim X, but it's got the 240mm radiator with one fan for the VRMs and that for the memory and all that on the card as well. But as you can see, it's already won quite a lot of awards from there compared to the Suprim X and Gaming X. The pricing is very, very interesting. I'm looking at the pricing right now at Newegg. Gaming X is $1,649. Suprim X is $1,739, so $19 more for that. And then the Liquid X or Suprim Liquid is $1,799. An extra $150 for the Gaming X. If you want to pick the cards up, I'm going to leave them in the description below, as well as my GPU Testbench setup. So then let's have a look at the specs. In terms of GPU actual specs, they're all the same. They're the 4090s, the same GPU, but MSI has kind of tuned them slightly differently, so let's have a look at that. So the Gaming X is promised to have boost speeds of 2,595 megahertz. Now, if you do use MSI Center, you can get extra boost clocks from the GPU, or GPU can boost even more if you want to use that. But I just tested it, you know, stock BIOS, what you can get with gaming or performance modes on these cards. And then it pulls roughly around 448 watts, and that's the max power draw on Firmark. The Suprim X is a little bit faster clock speeds, as you can see, 2625 megahertz, and then pulls roughly around the same wattage as the Gaming X. So it's interesting, it manages higher boost clocks with the same wattage. Now, this might not be with every single one of the cards, because there is a little bit of silicon lottery. Some of them might need a bit more voltage and wattage and so on. Some of them a bit less, you know, depending how they are there, just so you know. Very much the same as CPUs, but that's the cards that I have tested. And then the Liquid X has pretty much exactly the same clock speeds advertised as the Suprim X, but the TDP, or it pulls 477 watts at stock settings with the gaming BIOS on Firmark. When you look at the GPU clock speeds on Firmark, then the Liquid X actually boosts higher than the Suprim X, so the Liquid card actually does boost higher at full utilization as well compared to the air-cooled card. Let's have a look at the benchmarks now. Geekbench 5, just to kind of see the overall general benchmarks. The Suprim X is very, very similar, within 4.3% at the maximum compared to the Gaming X, but that's the Vulkan score difference. Bear in mind, the Vulkan kind of benchmarks for this shoot all over the place. The OpenCL and CUDA are much more kind of stable and in the same ballpark.
Who's at the door? Who's at the door?
So when we're looking at the Liquid X, it's actually not much different than the Suprim X or Gaming X, at least not noticeable difference there. In OpenCL we are 3.8% faster, but there's difference in the actual drivers as well, which I want to mention here as well. I do run different versions of the 4090 drivers as they have progressed over the months when 4090 was launched. The earliest driver is on the Suprim X, then comes the Gaming X with a bit of a newer driver, and then Liquid X with the latest driver that's been released in May here now. So one of them is right early there, and then one of them a few months ago, and then now one of them here. So there's about 6 months difference or 7 months difference between the earliest and latest driver here. Just so you know as well, there is a little bit of a driver difference. So if you do see some performance increase with the newest drivers, I'd recommend going with the newer drivers. So if you haven't updated the driver, perhaps now is time to just check to see if there's an update for your 4090. Looking at Photoshop difference here, there is really not a big difference here. Yes, we can see that the Liquid X is minus 1.8% slower really than the Gaming X, but that's within the margin of error that I would say is between 2 to 3%. So you're really not gonna get any performance difference there. The GPU score is actually a little bit better on the Suprim X, but honestly, it could be to do with a lot of different things. There is no really difference. And the same with Lightroom Classic, no actual performance difference. What about video editing? Let's take a look. Premiere Pro, we can see that these cards perform within 1% of each other. In the overall and standard scores, which just shows really no difference there. By the way, I'm doing the benchmarks about 7 or 10 times and then calculating the average of all of the scores, and each benchmark has actually a few times that it does the test as well. So it does the GPU score or GPU test a few times. So the actual average is with a lot of tests, maybe 20, 30 tests, and then that's the average of this, just so you know how it works. Moving on to After Effects, the difference is, again, not a lot. The overall score is within 2% of this. Interestingly, for some reason, the Liquid X with the newest driver, the same version of After Effects though, is about 16% slower in the GPU score. Now, I'm not sure why that is, because it's just, I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon. But we can again conclude that these cards really don't perform any different in After Effects either. Moving on to Davinci Resolve, which is interesting here. For some reason, the Liquid X with the newest GeForce driver performs about 10% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. I don't know why this is. Maybe Davinci Resolve was crashing something there, or something else was running in the background that I didn't know. I always pause Windows updates and everything as much as I can, but for some reason it's 10% slower. Now, I wouldn't go based on my benchmarks in here, but I think it's still important to show because as to the best of my abilities, I'm seeing this perform there. And this test has been done many, many times in the average. They were all in the same ballpark. I would still say that these cards perform the same in Davinci Resolve. As you can see, the Suprim X and Gaming X, they are 1.4 to 1.5% within the same ballpark. Gaming X seems to be the fastest card for some reason with some of the earliest drivers. Moving on to 3D and V-Ray, and here we can see that actually the cards, there's nothing wrong with the drivers cards, and you can see that the Liquid X performs the best out of all of these 3D benchmarks now. V-Ray first. The Suprim X is slightly slower than Gaming X for some reason, interestingly, probably due to the older driver. The Liquid X with the newest driver is about 2% faster than the Gaming X and Suprim X. in CUDA and RTX scores. The RTX score is slightly slower than Gaming X, interestingly. You know, pretty much the same again. In Blender here, we see a little bit of a difference. The Gaming X, bear in mind, is the middle version of the driver. And then the Suprim X, that has a little bit of an earlier version of the driver, is slightly slower in Monster scene, but a bit faster in Junk Shop and Classroom scene. Not a massive amount and not a noticeable amount, but then the Liquid X with the newest driver performs about 10% faster, 10 to 13 or 14% faster than the Suprim X and Gaming X, which could be due to the better cooling of the card, because now in 3D we're really utilizing the card a lot and we're cooling the card down a lot, so it might be able to run and boost a bit higher clock speeds, but also a newer driver. And in Octanebench we can see that the Suprim X is 3.7% faster than the Gaming X, and Liquid X is about 12% faster than the Gaming X, and 7 or something like that % faster than the Suprim X. So there is a measurable difference in 3D as much as we utilize the cards a bit more. The programs that are kind of mixed CPU and GPU use, you're not going to see a difference. In video and photo editing, not worth it. Another thing to consider is the temperatures and power draw, and how does it cool down the card. So looking at the Suprim X here and Liquid X, just to put these cards next to each other because they're like the, you know, high-end MSI 1490 cards, one of them air cooled and one of them liquid cooled, to really see, it's really the same card really, to see how much performance and what's the actual, you know, cooling difference. We can see that the max power draw on the Suprim X is about 448 watts that I can see from Thermark. The Liquid X max power draw was 490 watts, which is quite a bit more. Now the ambient temperature is a little bit cooler on the Liquid X, but we are testing the GPU temperatures over the ambient, just so you know. The 30-minute temperatures after running Thermark full load, the difference is 0.2 degrees on the Liquid X while pulling a lot more power. So the Liquid X is able to cool the card down much more and much quieter, by the way, than the Suprim X while pulling more power. So yes, the Liquid X does have a better cooler, and if you're looking at the hotspot, you can see that the hotspot difference is quite a bit different. It's extra 5.6 degrees more, so about 10% more the hotspot difference. It does cool it down much better. At full utilization, we're pulling up 477 watts, 479, 80 watts, something like that, but it peaks 490. So we can see that MSI actually has put even more overclocking for this card here, and it does come boosting much higher from the factory with this card. But then the most important questions to ask yourself: do you get any extra performance with this card, the, you know, most expensive card out of this bunch? Well, not really. Only in 3D performance we can see a difference, but I'd say not really worth the price difference for a single card. Is it quieter and cooler? Yes, it definitely is. But I really don't want to mention the fan curves of this card. The stock fan curves that it comes with, I don't think they are as good as you would get with manually adjusting them. I know you'd have to go to the likes of MSI Afterburner to actually adjust them and do them yourself, but the fans actually turn off a lot of the time, like you'd have on an air-cooled car. They turn off, but the radiator gets very, very, very hot in there, like hot to the touch that I'm thinking, is there something wrong with the card? It does get very, very warm. I would have the fan spin like the minimum 500 or something like that speeds all the time, just so that there's some airflow through the rad and it will keep the card much cooler temperatures. And the fans, I didn't ever see them like 100% utilization, so you can push the cooling even more, but because the card didn't reach temperatures that it would actually push the card, you know, the fans even more. So it does have a bit of cooling still in its sleeve. Is it worth the extra performance? And I would say no, it's not really. You'd get pretty much the same performance with the lower end 1490 Gaming X than this Liquid X. And you're asking, well, what are you talking about? Is it worth it then? And I'd say yes, it definitely is. And here's the biggest example why. You can see in this PC, This is made for 3D rendering. For someone who wants to crack on with Octane Render or V-Ray or Arnold or somewhere where you can utilize a lot of GPUs at the same time, this is it. But all the other air-cooled 4090s are so over-engineered and the coolers are so big. As you can see, there's two Asus TUF cards in there. MSI Suprim X or the Gaming X air-cooled cards, they're pretty much the same size. They go about 3.5 slots in thickness, some of them more, like getting close to 4 card slots. Which actually it does take 4 slots out of the motherboard, and you'd only be able to mount 2 of them inside a case like that. For example, if you're running a Threadripper or a Xeon system where you have a lot of PCI lanes and you could have a lot of GPUs in there for rendering, you'd have to run some kind of a janky system like I have over here. This 4090 here is not actually screwed in, is held on by zip ties in the back of the case, pulled through the rubber commets in the back of the case, and that's why it's on an angle here. It's completely fine, but this is not an ideal setup. The much better version would be if we paid a little bit more for the cards and get the Suprim X card. We'd be able to fit a lot more cards in there and it would look so much neater. You could easily put the rad on the top, another one in the front, another one on the bottom, another one in there. I mean, you've got a lot of options. Some of the newer cases like the Fantex NV7 come with even a 240mm rad support in the back of the case. So you could put the rad in the back of the case as exhaust out of the case as well if you wanted to. So it does make a lot of sense, and that's why I think if you are a 3D renderer, going with these cards will make sense and it's worth the money. And you might be even saving money when going with these. Let's say you're not bottlenecked by the VRAM and you don't need more VRAM for your graphics cards, but just a lot of GPU calculating rendering power. Then instead of going with the Ada A6000 cards, the quadro cards, they're not quadro anymore, just so you know, they're A6000 or A5000, 4000, they're A series cards now. Then yes, they are also 2 slot thick, which this Suprim X is here. But the Ada cards cost more than 3 times the amount of a Suprim Liquid X card. So you could get 3 times the rendering performance of an A6000 Ada when going with these Suprim X 4090 cards. Sorry, Suprim Liquid X, that's the official names. So Gaming X Trio, Suprim X, Suprim Liquid X, as you can see here. And that's why this will make sense. And there's nothing like that on the market. Asus doesn't provide liquid-cooled GPUs, but Gigabyte's card is 360mm radiator, which will take a lot more space in your case. But as you can see, even a 240mm one is well enough. You don't need the 360mm. It's just a show off. It's much easier to fit 240mm, and that's the point. If you are a creator and you need these cards, or perhaps you're thinking, do you know what, I need a new card or another card in the future, then going with these Suprim Liquid X cards is the best option. And I wish I had a few more of these so I could actually replace the TUF air-cooled cards here, because that would make a lot more sense in this PC build. Knowing that, now the price difference isn't actually that big if you need a secondary GPU or 3 RTX 4090s. In fact, 4 RTX 4090s. If I had a different case, I could even put 4 in here, which is just absolutely crazy. But at the same time, if you need a single card and you want the best performance, really you're better off saving your money and going with the Gaming X Trio, for example, because there is no real card difference per cards. If you want to check out these cards, I'm going to leave them in the description below. But I do want to mention that the Suprim X air-cooled card is probably one of the nicest cards that are out there, because there is not so much gaming. This TUF ones, they still say TUF gaming on it, which I'm not a big fan. But the Suprim X, it just feels like there's a diamond in there. It feels premium. It feels very nice design in there. And then it's the same about this Suprim Liquid X. There's a nice LED RGB in there that's configurable. And then the Suprim X, obviously you don't see the LED underneath. Oh yeah, you can see there a little bit. flashing there. But also, if you do want to save money building a PC as a creator and you don't want to spend loads and you're up for building yourself one, then check out the build guides in the description below. I've actually noticed that the prices have gone down, so now the price point that I'm mentioning there, you can save even more. Go check them out. There's a PC build for you, whatever your budget is, it's down there. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.